When we look at history, we often tend to look at single events at a time and analyze them in depth. That is one way of looking at history, but another and just as fascinating thing to look at with the subject is to see where historical events lie in the grand scheme of things. How do events in history fit into the bigger picture? There are events that are cause and effect of each other, and there are events that aren't necessarily related, but they happen contemporaneously with each other. In this video, what I would like to do is take a look at the RMS Titanic and look at its contemporary history, if you will. Things that we look at and view as history today was current events for the people of 1912. This is a very fascinating subject for me. Let's go back in time to 1912 and think. If you were a passenger or a crew member on the RMS Titanic, what kind of current events would you have been aware of? And what kind of things would you talk about? That's what this video is going to be about, so let's get started. Before we do, though, there is a disclaimer I do need to make. I am not affiliated with Titanic Honor and Glory. I am just a fan, like many of you watching this video. I am not making any money off of this video. This is purely a fan work, and I will not put any sort of advertisement in it. It is purely for educational and entertainment purposes. For my source, where I will be getting my list of various historical events, I will be primarily relying on Wikipedia because it is a free source that we all have access to and we can discuss. The other reason is that as much as I would love to use a major newspaper's online archives and look at the newspapers that came out at the time, many of them tend to have a paywall, which is rather frustrating. And finally, there is one event that I'm not going to be discussing in this video because I don't think I could do it justice, and that is the coal strike. Now, I know that it has been brought up a couple times in some of the videos that Titanic Honor and Glory has done so far, but the thing is, I don't feel knowledgeable enough to address it in a way that you, the viewer, would find satisfying. I feel that Tom, Matt, and Kyle, they could do a much better video on it in the future, and who knows, maybe they will. It's possible. And that's all this is going to be. It's a fan video, and we're going to explore history in a contemporary context. With that in mind, let's get started. The other thing I do want to mention is that I do have my notes on hand. If you see me bring these in front of the camera every now and then, that's me referring to my notes to make sure that every point I do want to hit in this video is not missed. With that in mind, let's start looking at history in a contemporary context. So, history was not focused on the Titanic in April 1912. History was ongoing all over the world. So, what kinds of events were happening? Well, let's start with April 14th, 1912, and work our way back. It's rather unlikely that the majority of people on board Titanic would have known about these events, but it does illustrate the point of this video, that history was happening all over the world as the Titanic sailed across the Atlantic. For example, on April 13th, 1912, King George V of the United Kingdom established the Royal Flying Corps, a precursor to the Royal Air Force. And this is a very fascinating event. In 1912, aircraft was only in its infancy technology-wise. But this does illustrate what was to come. It foreshadows the rise of aircraft being used in a military capacity, which 2 years later, the world would find out all too well when World War I broke out. Now let's go back another day, April 12th, 1912. One for the sports fans. The legendary Chicago Cubs lineup of Joe Tinker, Johnny Evers, and Frank Chance played their last game together. Now, I'm not too knowledgeable on sports history, but what I can tell you is that that lineup is one of the most famous and highly regarded in American baseball history, and it's immortalized in the poem Baseball's Sad Lexicon. Also on April 12th, 1912, Clara Barton, a nurse who served during the American Civil War, and the founder of the American Red Cross, died at age 90 years old. I can't find too much on if her death made international headlines, but still, it's a very interesting event that happened, nonetheless. Now let's go to April 11th, 1912. Major General Frederick Grant, the eldest son of former American President Ulysses S. Grant, died at 61 years old. While it doesn't appear that he had the same level of prestige as his father, it should be noted that his death was still significant, because when the younger Grant died, he was the second highest ranking man in the United States Army who was still in active service. My apologies. So, with that in mind, let's say the word of General Grant's death did get to the Titanic. What kind of people would have had a reaction to it? Well, if I had to take an educated guess, probably Major Archibald Butt, the military aide to President William Howard Taft. What kind of reaction would he have? That's hard to say, but almost certainly he would have a reaction to the death of a superior officer. Now, with that in mind, let's go to April 10th, 1912. And could this have been foreshadowing the French liner Niagara? You'll have to forgive me, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. The Niagara? If you know the answer, please put it in the comments. I would greatly appreciate it. This French liner struck ice on April 10th, 1912. And oddly enough, it also happened not too far from Newfoundland. But the leaks were repaired on the French liner, and she safely made it to port. Would Titanic's passengers and crew have known about this accident? Probably not, and for a simple reason. From what I can find, it seems that the New York Times did not report on that accident until April 17th. Which means that if they only found out about it then, imagine how much longer it would have taken for word to get to the European side, or even the United Kingdom. So, that's the events that happened during the voyage. What kind of things would have happened preceding the voyage? Let's find out. Now let's look at the period of history from April 1st through April 9th, 1912, the immediate week and a half or so that preceded Titanic's voyage. Again, I am referring to my notes because I do not want to miss any important points. On April 9th, President William Howard Taft of the United States, he signed legislation that created the United States Children's Bureau. This agency is very notable because, in a time where almost all government workers were male, this agency was almost entirely staffed and run by females. And now let's go to April 8th, 1912. Andrew Sachs, the businessman who founded Saks Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in New York City, passed away at 65 years old. It appears that he was more of a businessman than a fashion designer, but given that he ran one of the more notable stores in Manhattan, there is a possibility that some passengers would have had a reaction to his death. Could, say, Lady Duff Gordon, the fashion designer, who was in a similar field to Mr. Sachs, have had a reaction to his death? Hard to say. But this does illustrate the important point. History was not just focused on the Titanic in April 1912. History was happening all over the world. Now let's talk about April 3rd. In the interest of time, I'm only going to highlight a few very interesting events of this period. Galbraith Rogers, an early pioneer of aviation, passed away in a plane crash. The reason why this death is so significant is because although he's not as famous today compared to the Wright brothers or Charles Lindbergh, in his time he was a national celebrity because he was the first man to make a transcontinental flight across the United States. Specifically, during the period from September 17th to November 5th, 1911, granted he did make several stops, but he did make a successful transcontinental flight across the United States. So when he died in a plane accident that was the result of a bird crash, his death was basically treated like the death of a celebrity. I can't find too much about Galbraith Rogers' fame on the international level, but surely any American Titanic passengers who had an interest in aviation would have had a reaction to his death. Which brings us to April 2nd and April 1st, 1912. Now, there are interesting events that did happen on these days, but because they're part of larger events, I'm going to discuss them in the context of these larger events. On April 2nd, 1912, 4 new senators were sworn into the United States Senate, bringing their numbers up from 92 to 96. And that's because Arizona and New Mexico had just been admitted to the Union. New Mexico had been admitted on January 6th, 1912, and Arizona on February 14th, 1912. Now, any American passenger would have regarded this as big news, almost certainly. Major Archibald Butt, bringing him up again. He was a government official. He might talk about this in the right context. But yes, this was almost certainly big news in 1912, for the Americans at least. Now let's look at April 1st, 1912. The ship, the Terra Nova, arrived in New Zealand without Captain Robert Falcon Scott and the 4 men who joined his Antarctic expedition on board. None of the 5 were on board the ship. Why? Well, nobody knew it at the time, but Captain Scott's Antarctic expedition had resulted in the deaths of the 5 men. Context is key here. In 1911, arguably the biggest story of the time was the Antarctic expeditions, to be the first person to reach the South Pole. And the big story was the competition of sorts between the British expedition, led by Captain Scott, and the Norwegian expedition, led by Roald Amundsen. Now, Amundsen reached the South Pole on December 14th, 1911. And Robert Falcon Scott, he would follow weeks later on January 17th, 1912. So, looking at history in a contemporary context, given that the New York Times reported on the success of Amundsen's expedition on March 8th, 1912, it's almost certain that by the time Titanic was sailing, the passengers would have been at the very least aware of the success of the Norwegian expedition. But would they have been aware of what had happened to Captain Scott and the British expedition? That is not likely. The British expedition probably would not have been referred to as a failed expedition because, at the time, it was just simply that they hadn't returned from their journey to the South Pole yet. And the thing that's also important to remember is that Scott and his companions were not discovered dead until a search party went out to find them in October 1912. So, from what I was able to find with my available sources, it does not seem that the full story of the Antarctic expeditions as we know it today, that full story was not known in April 1912. So, will we hear about the Antarctic expedition being talked about by Titanic's passengers and crew? Possibly. It was a very big story, so certainly any British or Norwegian passengers would have had some level of interest in these expeditions because to some, it was a matter of national pride to be the first to reach the South Pole. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to consult my notes. Let's see what comes next. Now that we're done with April 1912, let's look at the period from January 1912 to March 1912 and see what events were happening at the time. Again, in the interest of time, I'm only going to highlight some of the more interesting ones that happened during this 3-month period. Starting with March 26th and working our way back, the gift of 3,000 cherry trees arrived in Washington, D.C. as a gift from the mayor of Tokyo. It was meant to symbolize the friendship between the two countries. So, could this be brought up on Titanic? Possible. Could the only Japanese passenger, Masabumi Hosono, could he have brought up this event? Personally, I think that prospect is unlikely, given that Hosono had spent the last 2 years in Russia, and he was traveling via London on his way home. So, could he be aware of that? Maybe the news did reach him in some way, but that's hard to say at this point in time. So, regardless, it is an interesting event. March 23rd. The remains of 67 men who were found inside the wreck of the USS Maine, which had been raised from Havana Harbor earlier that month, were buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, bear in mind, the USS Maine was the ship that blew up, and the incident was used to start the Spanish-American War. Now, with that in mind, the fact that 14 years later, 67 men who had been more or less buried underwater all these years to finally be laid to rest in a military cemetery, to some, this was probably a very big deal. Now we go to March 16th, 1912. The ocean liner Oceana? I'll show you the name in case you know how to properly pronounce it. The Oceana. Again, if you know how to properly pronounce these names when I show you them, that would be a huge help. Let me know in the comments. Thank you. So, this ship of the P&O line collided with another ship and sank. Although all 241 people aboard were successfully evacuated, 9 of them died when their lifeboat capsized, and another boat nearly turned over before the occupants were saved. There is actually some speculation that on Titanic, there were some people who were hesitant to board the lifeboats because of this incident. With that in mind, it's entirely possible that there were people who were not only aware of it, but it may come up in conversation. So, now let's move on to the next event. March 8th, 1912. The German Reichstag voted to make the German Imperial Navy, and I quote, the greatest in the world by 1920. Now you must remember, in context, in the decades before 1912, throughout the European powers, there was this rampant rise in nationalism and militarism, and this was among the contributing factors that led to World War I in 1914. With that in mind, a move like this by Germany makes sense in the contemporary context. Now for March 6, 1912, the Oreo cookie is introduced. There isn't really a tie-in to Titanic per se with this one, but still, it's a very interesting event nonetheless. Now for March 2nd, 1912. President Taft of the United States issued a proclamation urging American citizens not to visit Mexico and advising those who were living in Mexico to leave. Now, the Mexican Revolution was relatively young at the time, having begun in 1910. With that in mind, it is entirely possible that William Howard Taft had foresight into what was to come, since the Mexican Revolution would not end until 1920, which in 1912 meant it was going to happen for another 8 years. February 26th, William IV, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg, passed away. As a member of the European monarchy to die while he was still on the throne, no doubt his death would have been known to, at the very least, passengers from the neighboring European countries. From what I have seen in my research, it does not seem there was anyone from Luxembourg aboard Titanic, but there were definitely people aboard from the neighboring countries. So, if it came up in context, surely the death of a reigning monarch would have been big news, even more than a month after his death. Which brings us to February 24th, 1912. The Battle of Beirut of the Italo-Ottoman War takes place. 2 Italian cruisers sank over half a dozen Ottoman ships, while suffering no losses themselves. If there's any Italian or Ottoman passengers aboard Titanic, there's a pretty good chance they have strong feelings about this battle or, by extension, the Italo-Ottoman War. Now we go to February 12th, 1912. The last emperor of China abdicates, which, by extension, marks the end of China's last ruling dynasty. Bear in mind, China had been ruled by dynasties and emperors for more than 2,000 years, so this represented a substantial change in the status quo of the world. The Republic of China would succeed this Chinese dynasty, which does bring me to January 1st, 1912. The Republic of China was officially established, despite coexisting with said dynasty for about 6 weeks. The Republic would officially succeed the dynasty on February 12th. Given how significant an event this was for China, it does make me believe that if you interacted with any of the Chinese passengers on board, I believe there were 6 or 8 of them, but I'm having trouble recalling at this exact moment. If you interacted with them, this is something they may very well talk about. Of course, everything I just talked about is but a mere handful of events that could be referenced. But now we have a pretty good idea of the current events that were going on in the world, the kinds of things the passengers and crew would have been aware of. So now, let's look at one last stretch of time. We're going to look at 1911 and highlight some of the major events from the preceding year. Starting with December 1911 and working our way back. On December 14th, 1911, Roald Amundsen and his fellow Norwegians reached the South Pole and were the first men to do so. Now, no one would be aware of this at the time. They wouldn't find out for several more weeks. but still, it remains a significant event in history. Now we go to September 20th, 1911. The HMS Hawke and the RMS Olympic have their accident where they collided with each other. Now, it was rather substantial in Titanic's story, as many of you already know, because it delayed Titanic's maiden voyage because Olympic needed the repairs. So, who would talk about this on board Titanic? Probably stewardess Violet Jessup, who was aboard the Olympic when the accident happened. If you talk to her, she might bring it up in a context that makes sense. Now, that comes to August 21st, 1911. The Mona Lisa, a painting which is famous and iconic today, but wasn't actually a really famous piece in 1911. It was stolen from the Louvre in Paris. So here's the context that needs to be bared in mind. As I just said, during this time period, the Mona Lisa was just another painting, really. It didn't have its famous, iconic status it has today. So, referring to my notes again, it was really one of Da Vinci's more unknown works in 1911. So, this theft gave the painting international fame, and it was a big story for the time period. Granted, the painting would not be recovered until 1913. Theft, no doubt, would be a story familiar to, at the very least, a portion of Titanic's first-class passengers. Maybe second class, third class, depending on if they had an interest in art. It's hard to say. What kind of passenger would talk about the Mona Lisa theft? Well, Moritz Håkan Bjornström Stephenson, he was transporting a painting on Titanic that was unfortunately lost in the sinking. Perhaps if you talked to him about art, that would be a topic that would come up in the discussion. That's hard to say, again, but it does give you a sense of the events that were going on at the time period. Now we come to July 24th, 1911. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu in Peru. Now, before this rediscovery, it was really only known to local farmers in Peru, this site which is now world famous. So, the fact that it was brought to international attention was a huge story in 1911. So, if you were on Titanic, what kind of person would talk about it, passenger or crew? Was there someone from Peru aboard Titanic? As a matter of fact, yes, there was. His name was Peter Dennis Daly, and he was a first-class passenger that survived on collapsible A. Given that he was from Peru, it's entirely possible, if you talk to him about it, he could bring up the discovery of Machu Picchu. Now we come to March 24th, 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in New York City, which killed 146 people, mostly women. While there doesn't appear to be much in terms of international attention, it was a huge story for Americans at the time period, because this was a tragedy that brought national attention to the sweatshop conditions for factory workers. So, could certain American passengers bring it up in a context that made sense? Maybe. It was one of the biggest stories in America in 1911, so, relatively speaking, it was fairly recent going into 1912. Now, throughout 1911, there were many events that happened that related to the previously mentioned Mexican Revolution. Referring to my notes so I don't miss anything important. Is there anyone on board Titanic who would talk about the Mexican Revolution? Well, that is entirely possible, because, as a matter of fact, there was a passenger from Mexico aboard Titanic. First-class passenger Don Manuel E. Uru Chertu? I'll show you the name just to be on the safe side in case anyone has a better idea of how to pronounce it. He was from Mexico City, but unfortunately he perished in the sinking. It hits close to home for him when you think about it, so he probably would be one to bring it up if you spoke to him in a context that made sense. Now, one topic I am aware of, but I'm not going to discuss too much in this video, is the ongoing Irish republicanism and nationalism of the time period and their tensions with Great Britain. I do not feel that I know enough about that topic that justifies discussing it, because it's one of those really complex issues where you need to know the full story in order to discuss it properly, which I don't. So, who knows? Among the Irish and British passengers, that very well could be something that would be brought up in context. I will say that. In conclusion, I do want to reiterate the theme of this video. History in April 1912 was not focused around the Titanic alone. History was happening all over the world concurrently with the Titanic's voyage and sinking. With that in mind, the contemporary history would have been referred to by Titanic's passenger and crew as current events. So, what kind of topics would come up if you talked to these people and asked them about the current events? Now, taking a look at everything we've just discussed in this video, a lot of it does seem to be fair game, but if we had to narrow it down to a few key ones that seem like the big stories of the time period, the ones that do seem to warrant attention are the British and Norwegian Antarctic expeditions, the Mexican Revolution, the Italo-Ottoman War, the admission of Arizona and New Mexico into the United States, and the establishment of the Republic of China. These were some very big stories of the day, and even though today we look at them as history, back then they were current events. They were the news. So, with that in mind, that concludes this video. What do you think? What kind of events could be discussed if you asked about the news as a passenger or crewman on Titanic? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a discussion. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.